First of all, welcome everyone. This is a new initiative from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We've been having lots of seminars, but we've started now setting up a regular seminar series. And we are particularly pleased tonight to open this series with an old friend of IIPP, Professor Leonardo Burlamaqui. And also, I'm particularly pleased that Olga Mikhaeva, who is one of our Marie Curie fellow, just joined IIPP. She will act as a discussant in this meeting. For those of you who don't know me, I am Antonio Andreoni. I'm Associate Professor of Industrial Economics at IIPP, and also I'm Head of Research, and I'm convening these seminar series. Before we start, let me just give you some small housekeeping remarks. So first of all, we are many of you are familiar with Zoom webinar facilities. Everyone who is in the attendees list will be given the chance to join the panelist podium in the Q&A discussion later in the second part of the seminar. The seminar will be starting with Leonardo, who will be delivering a paper in 35-40 minutes, and will be followed by some remarks and questions from Olga, our discussant for today. And we will then get just a 5 minutes health break. And I will invite you in that break to start raising your hands in the chat so that I can identify people who want to join the panel to engage with Leonardo, Olga, on the topic of today's discussion event. So that is basically the structure of the format. Before I give the floor to Leonardo, let's just say a few words about Leonardo. Leonardo is a professor at the Department of Economic Evolution at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and has been for several years research scholar also at the Levy Economics Institute at the Bar College in New York. And among his other important roles, he has been an important person for all the academic community working on evolutionary and post-Keynesian economics as a senior program officer at the Ford Foundation in New York. Many programs that have been in these last years focusing on evolutionary thinking and research have been actually connected to lots of important work that Leonardo was doing in the Ford Foundation. And there he was directing reforming global financial governance initiative. Leonardo's worked for many years on evolutionary economics, Schumpeterian economics, Miskian, research in Miskian financial research, and today is giving us a new paper which is coming out in the IIPP Working Paper Series called Schumpeter, the Entrepreneurial State and China. So we are particularly pleased to have Leonardo opening this series. And for many of you who are interested in the paper, the website, UCI website, had some problems, some glitches over the last 2 days. So the paper has not been uploaded yet, but will be latest by tomorrow. It's going to be online in our webpage. Without further ado, Leonardo, the floor is yours. Welcome again. And I will keep an eye on also the Q&A chat. Those of you who want to comment or reflect while we are in the process of delivering the lecture, the seminar, you are very welcome to do so. And you're also welcome to use our Twitter account for exchanging ideas, comments. Leonardo, the floor is yours.
Okay.
And before I start again, sorry, we are recording the event, so everyone should be aware that this event is going to be online in our YouTube channel.
Okay.
It's really yours.
Thanks. So, thank you, Antonio. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we're spread all over the place, right? And let me begin by thanking Antonio's invitation, Mariana, of course, Rainer, good friends of IIPP, Victoria for all the backstore work, and of course, all participants. And Olga, that will be probably criticizing and, as Schumpeter would say, shooting at my paper right before I finish it. And let me start, well, let me share the screen here and just put the paper there. But let me start by very quickly linking and then delinking Schumpeter from the COVID-19 recovery discussion, because if you Google COVID-19 and creative destruction, you end up with a bunch of, I would say, crazy ideas about letting the market perform its function, let creative destruction take hold, which means viable business, okay, non-viable business, well, this is the reality. And a lot of those figures, Mr. Tesla among them, end up invoking Schumpeter as their source of inspiration. And I would say this would not be Schumpeter's answers for today. And that's mostly because of something which is quite much hidden in his works, but I think it ends up being a very coherent set of ideas in terms of state action and how the state should participate, and especially in a more socialized kind of environment, how the state could perform very useful functions and could even help a system like that to beat big business capitalism in terms of performing several functions. So that's what I will try to show you today. But in a way, that's kind of a puzzle. What is the puzzle? Well, where's the state in Schumpeter's basic model? Let me start then here. This is the basic, let me move it here. His basic model, right? Both for the cycle and the creative destruction paradigm. Finance, entrepreneurship, innovation, which can be radical, incremental, process, product, legal, financial. It's a whole bunch. It's not only technology, it's much more than that. And then as a result, you have competition by means of innovation, you have profits, you have conflicts, and you have structural change. So then the question that obviously arises is, well, where's the state? State's not there. The model is not built to accommodate the state, but state is here. And what do I mean by here? Well, the institutional and policy frameworks, they're always there. Along with the Schumpeter's economics, there is his economic sociology, which is somewhat downplayed for a lot of the literature about the whole set of ideas that Schumpeter puts forward, but it's there. So the state belongs to the economic sociology sphere, but it should be linked to the way he thinks about evolution or economic evolution properly. And so if we take that road, we can very, very early on, we can see some clues. For example, this is a very interesting observation. There is a great difference between entrepreneurial and rentier states. That couldn't be more modern than that. And that was written in 1918, in the crisis of the tax state, right? And then if we go to business cycles, the second volume, we can read that. The state gave leads, exerted pressure in financing and promoting. This active leadership was, of course, something very different from mere control or regulation and from mere conditioning. That's also very interesting as a clue. And when we get to capitalism, socialism, democracy, the part where he is discussing not capitalism, but socialism, we can read that. By socialist society, we shall designate an institutional pattern where the economic affairs of society belong to the public and not to the private sphere. He could be a part of IIPP, right? With a declaration like that, I think it's very much on target. And if we go that line or that line of reasoning, we can put in some, let's say, unanticipated allies. For example, Mr. Keynes in the last chapter of General Theory. Well, that's a very, very much well-known quote. I conceive, therefore, that a comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means of securing approximation of full employment with public authority, where public authority will cooperate with private initiative. So that's Keynes, unsurprisingly, going the same way. We have Hubert Henderson, who was a Keynes co-author and also had a lot of exchanges with him, which introduces this, which is what I really suggest is that the state should assume the role of entrepreneur in chief, directing the flow of productive resources to the employment way in which can best serve human needs. This is from 1943. And then we have a former student of Schumpeter that is also kind of well known right now, which is Minsky, in his book about Keynes, 1947, as socializations of the towering heights is fully compatible with a large, growing, and prosperous private sector. And this high consumption synthesis might well be conducive to greater freedom for entrepreneurial ability than is our present structure. That's kind of, I think, interesting. But then we go straight to the trying to pair Schumpeter and the state. Well, there's almost nothing written about that. Why? Because this is a hidden and very much unexplored topic in his work. And also, I think I must say that Schumpeter himself contributed very much for this to be hidden. He never really, as I tried to show a little bit before, never really incorporated the state formally in his models, but it is there. It can be put there because as we can see, as I said, it's absent, formally speaking, from his cycle theory, both from the theory of economic development and business cycles, and it's only in the sidelines of his creative destruction paradigm, which he offers to us in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So besides that, the state is a constant in his thinking and in his writings, okay? So I already mentioned the crisis of the tax state, and apart from that previous quote, we can read that fiscal measures have created and destroyed industries and industrial regions and have, in this manner, contributed directly to the construction of the edifice of modern economy. It couldn't be more explicit in terms of relating and linking directly the state with building up industries and industrial regions. And he's written that in 1918, okay? However, if we want to get more serious about that, we should go to not the first edition of the book, Theory of Economic Development, but when he does substantive work in terms of rewriting it for the English translation, which appeared in 1934, and in the closing pages, he exhibits a very new view in terms of what was already taking place about his thinking in terms of state action. He was really, I think, changing his mind. Not surprisingly, we were in the 30s, right? And there he is really modern and innovative because he is proposing a selective credit policy orchestrated by, guess who? The central bank, and intended to differentiate the old from the new and to prevent innovations from undergoing a destructive process, which is inherent in the depression. This is, as I said, in the very end of the book. The outcome would be a selective intervention by the state in order to preserve successful innovations from financial bankruptcy. I have to maybe excuse myself in terms of, I'm going to be presenting several quotes from Schumpeter, but I will have to do that. I feel that I have to do that because of the lack of concentration in terms of writings and attention for this part of his work. So instead of just asking you to believe me that he said this or that, I'm just like putting it in the screen for you to actually see the reference. But instead of a policy of indiscriminate credit restriction, a credit policy is also conceivable on the part of individual banks, but still more on the part of central banks with their influence upon private banking world, which would differentiate between the phenomena of normal process of recession, which have an economic function, and the phenomena of abnormal processes, I would say depressions, that destroy without function. So this is really, really modern, right? If we take just the private banks, I think this is right from Hilferding's playbook. The German banks, the 4Ds, Deutsch, Dresdner, Disconto, and Darmstadter. Those are the 4Ds that they were doing that. This is Hilferding's financial capital. So Schumpeter was very much in line with that. They were together in von Bawerk's seminar, and I think Schumpeter learned a lot from Hilferding in that. So this part of the private banks, I think he is like getting from Hilferding. But to insert directly the central bank there is really, really new. It's something that it's completely new for the moment there. Maybe the Manchurian bureaucrats were doing that in Japan in the 30s. And Schumpeter was also well read in Japanese economic history. So he might be into something in terms of observing what was being done there. But I'm not sure about that. But those excursions, they get more explicit in his 1939 two-volume, like crazy to read, more than 1,000 pages, Business Cycles. But we can see very interesting stuff there. For example, this one, was it not again in Germany, the state rather than the entrepreneur which initiated modern industry? The answer is in the affirmative, and similar answers would have to be returned for other countries. So the state directly performing, not more the entrepreneur. This is important to underline. This is an evolution in his own thinking. It's not, in the theory of economic development, he talks mostly about entrepreneurs as individuals. But then he starts to see big business around, and he starts to change his own terminology. It's not the entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneurial function that starts to be on the highlight. And this changes everything, because the entrepreneurial function can be performed by a firm, a group of firms, or by the state. And this is something that I think Schumpeter starts to understand, and he goes on into that. But it's never in his theoretical chapters, it's more on the historical chapters. The historical chapters of Business Cycles, they are a gem in this, because they explicitly address the state as an entrepreneur, the state's entrepreneurial actions in forging industries, and in shaping economic rationalization, among other things. We will get there. So he then concentrates, he mentions the US, he mentions even Brazil in a footnote, but he concentrates in the state-directed economy of Germany. No surprises about that, which means when Hitler and Hjalmar Schacht were in charge, and the German economy recovered in like 3 or 4 years, it was already at full employment. And Joan Robinson has a quip about that when Keynes was still trying to explain unemployment in 36, the German economy, as well as the Japanese economy, they were already in complete full employment, not only of resources, but also full employment in terms of employers, like the total full employment. So that's something that I think Schumpeter paid attention to. And as I said, German economy was operating at full capacity investment, and investment was filled with innovations, which was always something he was very much worried about. And what he's saying about that is that the outstanding feature here is rapid progress, practically without relapse toward full employment of resources in general and labor in particular. In fact, more than that, unmistakable symptoms of overemployment in our sense in many industries and shortage of labor. And then he goes to another very provocative thing to say. Theoretically, it is possible to plan the sequence of innovations to iron out the cycles, but after strenuous periods of advance, there will be recessions even in the corporate state. However, most of the symptoms of depressions need not to occur at all. Why? Because the state is hands-on. What do I get from that? I would suggest this clearly, a recipe for socialization of investment and what I call creative destruction management, okay? Which means that in a similar way that Keynes was like reasoning about, but with the, I would say, the advantage of getting innovation front and center, which is something that Keynes never really did. The idea was, okay, the state, with the state in managing, like state action, can smooth the range of economic fluctuations or the business cycles and eliminate the wasteful and unnecessary abnormal liquidations, which means the depressions brought about by the sort of normal model of business cycle. However, the full elaboration of these arguments would not be done in his, until he is not in theory of economic development, it's not in business cycles, it will be in Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy in 1942. And not in his analysis of capitalism, not in this creative destruction paradigm, but rather in his analysis of socialism. There we have a very, very interesting set of ideas. But before getting there, let me just highlight the two issues that I think that are most important in terms of clarifications, which are, number one, what Schumpeter really understood as a socialist economy, because it's very different from the average comprehension of what that is. It's very different from the Marxist tradition on that. And number two, what was his reasoning in terms of what are the motives that he gives that supports socialism potential superiority to even to big business capitalism. And then let me just underline here that he is not focusing in state seizure of the means of production, nor in the eradication of private property. Those things should exist. What he is really concentrating on is on their socialization, which in his reasoning is basically redesigning the frontiers and modes of interaction between the private and the public spheres. Again, we couldn't have something more modern than that. This is our discussion today. So that's why I think it's really important in terms of, let's go back to some of his writings and let's try to evolve from there. By socialist society, we shall designate an institutional partner in which the control of the means of production, and overproduction itself is vested with a central authority, or that the economic, again, the economic affairs of society belong to the public. and not to the private sphere. So what are the important building blocks here? First, the core concept of the definition is control by a central authority. And again, not the absence of private property that should exist, but nor the idea that you wouldn't be given, managers would not be given liberty to manage, make decisions, etc. They would and they should. What would happen is that there would have some sort of regulated managerial freedom. Well, let's put in Chalmers Johnson's parlance, administrative guidance, nothing else. No more, no less than that. This is what he's proposing. And I remember you again, 1942. Second, the innovative process could be coordinated, taking into account timing and location considerations, which means in the process of creative destruction, this would be performed in a coordinated manner, and destruction would be not like, he wouldn't support an economy filled with zombies, but exit policies would have to be crafted in order to perform an orderly, let's say, withdrawal of sectors that would not be used for or would be becoming obsolete precisely because of the impact of innovations and new technology upon the system and upon its evolution. So again, in his own words, the planning of progress, in particular, the systematic coordination and orderly distribution in time of new ventures in all lines would be incomparably more effective in the prevention of bursts and of depressive reactions. And the process of discarding the obsolete, that in capitalism means paralysis and losses, could be reduced to a comprehensive plan, providing a shifting to other uses of the non-obsolete complements of the obsolete plans. That's quite clever, I would say. Third, the relation between technological change and employment could be also rationalized by coordination policies so that it would be possible to redirect demand to other employments, which, if planning lives up to its possibilities at all, might in each case be waiting for them. Very modern. Fourth, resistances to changes would be strongly discouraged, and consequentially, the promotion of innovations would be operated in a quicker and more rational way. The whole, and this is quite important, the whole of our argument might be put in a nutshell by saying that socialization means a stride beyond big business, or that socialist management may conceivably prove superior to big business capitalism, as it has proved to be the kind of competitive capitalism of which the English industry of 100 years ago, again, is a sort of evolution for a more rationalized way of dealing with economic affairs. Again, why? Because they belong to the public sphere and not to the private sphere of society. There should then, this is what I get from that, there should be no doubt that this statement, what it really addresses, I would say it addresses the centrality of the economic role of the state in forging and guiding structural transformation. I don't see how to read this in a different fashion than that. And that, let's get this all in a sort of, try to get it in a nutshell. Let's call it Schumpeterian socialism and the entrepreneurial state. That's in a nutshell, okay? Okay, so public control of key development related issues affecting society as a whole, especially finance. Long-term strategies. Socialization of investment, meaning state-directed investment under a structural transformation strategy. Creative destruction management policies. Speeding up results, speeding up innovation and technological progress via public-private institutional arrangements and administrative guidance. Avoidance of involuntary unemployment and bumpy fluctuations in economic activity. Promotion of competition, private property, and managerial freedom, although properly supervised. Okay, then let's try to link Schumpeterian socialism with Schumpeter basic model. How can we do that? Well, I think we can. Let's try. Okay. We have finance, we have innovation, and now we have socialization of investment, okay? And how do we get with that? We get a more stable funding, uncertainty reduction, high-speed growth, and diminished financial fragility. We also get a direct linking of science to technological policies, to innovation, and to investment. And finally, we get state-guided investment, employment creation, plus creative destruction management. Which means we get a better coordination in terms of policy coordination, and we get less resistance to innovations, which means we get managed growth and structural change. Another way to see it is to start with Henderson's idea of the state as the entrepreneur-in-chief. And that means that it handles public financial institutions, socialization of investment, and long-term strategies. And from there, again, you get to public-private partnerships, which leads you, well, as a sort of a institutional framework like that, you can have a policy package that will give you a technological upgrade, continuous technological upgrading, infrastructure building, creative destruction management, and all of this obviously will result in terms of in employment creation, in permanent employment creation. What are the functions, if we agree with that, if we understand that this is a reasonable way of formulating the whole thing, what would be the main function of the entrepreneurial state in this sort of a Schumpeterian socialism that I'm submitting to you now? First, a funder not of last, but of first resort. Entrepreneur, investor-in-chief, long-term strategist, macro coordinator and financial regulator, competition enforcer and supervisor, market shaper, creative destruction manager. Those are very important functions, and all of them would belong to this sort of entrepreneurial state in a Schumpeterian sort of socialism. And then we can move to our conclusions, or provisional conclusions for now, before I get shoot by the questions, like Olga's questions, Antonio's questions, and the audience questions. So the key concluding statements would be, and those are mine, okay? The state, entrepreneurial or not, should be a central feature of any empirically relevant theory of development. And I think we economists should be shocked that it is not. More often than not, the state is not a central piece of the theories of most theories of economic development. Apart from, let's say, the SAPAL and the Asian development state, quite recent, in the theory of economic development, it's simply not there. So from a theoretical perspective, entrepreneurial states are the linchpins of development processes. And this again is lacks very much in the literature, in the traditional literature about economic development. What else? Okay, then I move to say East Asia's development trajectories corroborates not only East Asia, okay? If you look at the US, if you look at Germany, if you look at most of Europe, if you look at Brazil, this is true for all of them. The state is front and center. Without the state, you cannot understand neither modernization nor industrialization or successful modernization and successful industrialization. East Asia, in particular, really corroborates all those things, which means the developmental state is a key concept to understand them. But there is a problem there. It sort of lacks a proper economics. It's mostly the work of political science, sociologists, and others, which they have done great work, no doubt. But there isn't a proper economics to that. And what I'm saying and like proposing here is that Schumpeter's entrepreneurial state, along with his creative destruction paradigm, which is something that few people pay attention to as well, because what Schumpeter does in 1942 is that he destroys his previous cycle models, because they are completely different. Cycle models are mechanic and they are built upon equilibrium. They're not good. The creative destruction model is great because it's an open system. It's completely evolutionary. It not only doesn't depend on equilibrium, but it crushes equilibrium and says equilibrium and evolution are at odds with each other. If you are in the equilibrium side, you cannot be on the evolution side. And I firmly believe that. But this is not very much like highlighted in the studies, in the Schumpeter studies, that like it's almost like some linear evolution from 1911 until, I don't know, his death. And that's completely untrue. In that sense, capitalism, socialism, and democracy is a breakthrough in terms of what he's written before. And so, getting back, this is the cycle models are not compatible with the state. The state is exogenous. It's not exogenous to the creative destruction paradigm. It can very well be linked to it, and it works well. And I try to do this in another paper, another chapter in a book. And what I propose here is that it contributes, if you look at it that way, it contributes to fill a hole in the developmental stage literature, the sort of economics that is kind of still lacks. And it bridges surprisingly well with key elements of the works of Hilferding, for instance. I'm not exhausting. Hilferding, Gerschenkron could be here, Keynes, Minsky, Galbraith. We can really have a very nice research avenue to explore here, which I think it's just in its beginning. And then I move to my conclusion, which I have to say is about China, but I will obviously not in the sake of sparing time for the discussion, etc. I will not, I will just touch on China right now to say that it is repeating that trajectory on steroids. In the paper that will be available in a couple of days, I delve much deeper in China, in say like exemplifying and dissecting in a way what's the role of the entrepreneurial state that was just described in China. I'm not going to do this right now. I'm just gonna touch this in the subject, but you can go to the paper and you can see that there is much better developed than I will do right now. So my take or my key message here is that China's speed and ability to leapfrog, not only catch up, leapfrog its peer nations in the last 3 decades has no precedence in history. And this achievement, and this is a bold proposition, I'm ready to be attacked in this one, but I would say this key achievement stems largely from the fact that China is a Schumpeterian type of socialism supported by a fully developed entrepreneurial state, one that has exactly those characteristics, those traces that I just highlighted a few minutes ago. And well, China, okay, the state's vision, we can see things like that. The state is clearly the entrepreneur in chief there. It's not alone, it's cooperating with everybody, with a lot of agencies in it. It listens to foreign companies, and all foreign companies that matter are there, the ones which are not want to be there. So it has nothing to do with the sort of a Marxist tradition on looking and thinking about socialism. But that's China. And how do we picture what I just said very much in a nutshell in terms of the Chinese state? And then obviously I'm adding already a bit of Minsky and a bit of Keynes in characterizing this sort of entrepreneurial state. Finance, a financial system working essentially to fund development and social inclusion, which is very different from what the financial systems are doing in most of the Western places, not to mention a place like the US, right? US and UK, like just to be sure. Innovation, government entrepreneurship and skills, and direct government involvement with innovation. Socialization of investment, what is that? Forging the future, if you will, as a public policy matter, which means regulation, public-private partnerships, and market shaping. Okay, policy banks, development banks, public investment vehicles, strategic technological policies, innovation and industrial policies, pilot agencies, robust financial regulation, and institutional cooperation. In China, you have the People's Bank of China Central Bank and the big development banks. All the big banks in China are public banks, and they are essentially development banks. So you get long-term funding plus animal spirits, which are originating mostly at the commanding heights. Not exactly, they don't start in the entrepreneur. They start back in the state and they move on to the entrepreneur. State-sponsored Schumpeterian agendas, China's, the 5-year plans, China 2020, the Belt and Road Initiative, they are all examples of that. And we have Minsky's big bank, and we have Minsky's, the biggest bank there. Well, the Fed could dispute that. And the big government, which means the commanding heights there, the State Council, the Standing Committee, the Minister of Finance, but also in some instances, the provinces, the municipalities, public corporations, and all obviously public corporations, public manufacturing and private, and industrial corporations and infrastructure corporations, and also the links with private corporations. Well, the result is a managed structural change. Okay? That's China, and that's, I delve, again, let me just repeat that. I'll delve deeper, I go deeper in those in the paper. I'm not gonna spend time like developing this here because I won't have this time. And then we get the final takeaway. The final takeaway to me here would be the replacement of the expression socialism with Chinese characteristics that's used all the time, especially by Chinese authorities, and it has no meaning at all. What the hell is this? Socialism with Chinese characteristics. I never understood that, really. But I do understand socialism with Schumpeterian characteristics. If you link this to what I just said, you can have a much more analytical picture of what exactly is China nowadays. if we accept that, I would submit that this would or should improve the debate on both the institutional structure as well as the economic dynamics of China's unprecedented trajectory in 2 generations from lagger to leader. So China is not the only one, but I think it's the best in terms of exemplifying that. And of course, if you want to know more, you can have the paper that I hope will be uploaded in a couple of days. You can have this book, which is edited by myself and our good friend Rainer Cattell, and it has a lot of papers there. Mariana is there, Ronnie Ray is there, Bill Lazonic's there, John Matthews is there. So it gives you a broader picture. It's not about China. Mine is about China. Matthews talks a lot about China. Fred Block is there as well. So it's a book that not everybody will want to reach for, but the ones that think that Schumpeter is still relevant and that he deserves a sort of a 21st century agenda, an updating, etc. This would be, I think, an interesting read, although it's kind of expensive. This is my struggle with Routledge. Their policy is not good in that sense. And so that's it for now. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and I'm ready to be shoot at.
Thanks, Leonardo. I think this in a normal university room would get a round of applause. I think I cannot resist from just raising immediately 3 comments very briefly and then passing the word to Olga for a more structured discussion of your paper. What I found very interesting is from an intellectual point of view, the Schumpeter of the theory of economic development, where apparently at that time we're still getting lectures of maths every day, and he was sort of flirting with all that type of intellectual at that time, rising more, of course, neoclassical framework. And on the other hand, the Schumpeter of that you described through the business cycle and then more through the Caspian socialism and democracy. And in the middle, there is an historical significant transition also in terms of the financial sector and the way in which the financial system operated at that time, in terms of also division of commercial and investment banks and so on. So it would be very interesting if you could tell us a bit more about how you interpret this evolution, which in a sense is quite remarkable, right? It gives us an idea of an intellectual journey that himself, Schumpeter, was going through. The second point that struck me is this emphasis on the that you put on the not simply managing the innovation, but managing also the recession. And I mean, it's very well known that South Korea and many of the Asian countries use the recession cartels and many of these instruments as a way of managing conflicts and reducing the conflicts that are intrinsic to the political economy, intrinsic to innovation and change. And again, here would be interesting to see also some specific innovation that China might have put in place in terms of managing this specific type of conflict. If we think about the way in which, for example, they've been relying on a very original way of managing competition policy. So using a bit the framework of optimal competition, if you want, that Alice Amsden and Ajit Singh used to refer to in the context of Japan. And the third point is this issue around what is socialism in Schumpeter terms. And here, I'm pleased you mentioned Galbraith, because in the first lines when you were presenting, the new industrial state and the idea of the planning system, but within the capitalist system, was actually something that resonated a lot with that part of Schumpeter you described. So it would be interesting to know more about, how Schumpeter was, like Galbraith later, already anticipating, the fundamental advantage that planning and coordination, which we now see dominant in many, structures of value chains and businesses, is delivering. So lots of food for thoughts, I think, from your talk. So thanks again for a brilliant, I think was a very good way to have an IIPP type of initiation of a seminar series. There are lots of the ingredients of the everyday discussion that we have in the Institute. Without further ado, Olga, would you like to join the discussion with your remarks?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for it was a true pleasure to read the paper.
Thank you.
Especially the great care in a delicate manner in which you trace the evolution of the ideas of Schumpeter. Probably the time is super ripe for also entrepreneurial bureaucracies to enter the theoretical discussion by among innovation scholars. I think you know that cannot be overestimated. I have 5 questions / comments. The first one is, you refer to Minsky in the paper, and of course he was also a student, right, of Schumpeter, and he was also eager to interpret Schumpeterian ideas and concepts, I think. It made me think while I was reading the paper. It brought me inevitably to the another paper that you wrote together with Jan Kregel. It was many years ago, from 2006. I think it was a version of a working paper. And there is a quote, let me just read. In Minsky's terms, Schumpeterian entrepreneurs are speculative units, whereas true Schumpeterian entrepreneurs are quasi-Ponzi units. So this risk-taking is what makes Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, right? And I wonder if how then, because that's related to that, to what you're saying in the paper on page 10, that greater state involvement puts financial restraint to avoid casinos. But I think that casino was, at least in Minsky's interpretation of Schumpeter, casino was needed because true Schumpeterian entrepreneurs are quasi-Ponzi. And I wonder then, do you think it's a relevant issue to address when we talk about entrepreneurial state? Obviously, it's not equal to entrepreneur, but I wonder whether it's relevant to talk, whether you think it's relevant to talk about the risk-taking in that sense. So far, the paper made reference to financial risks when you discuss the case of China and the great involvement of state banks, and that, well, in case they will end up having a bunch of bad loans, that will be essentially an internal debt problem, and it will not severely affect China. But I also think that it's quite specific case because not all countries benefited from that huge reserves and that massive external demand from the outside economy, outside of China, that allowed to maybe confine that debt problem to internal system. Then another question is related. Schumpeter, of course, when he talks about socialism in his Capitalist Socialism Democracy book, refers to Marx, and he describes Marxian economics. And he writes about the transition, particularly in chapter 19. It's about, he differentiates between mature and premature transition to socialism. And I wonder, he says the well-capitalist class will be slowly replaced by managerial class. There will be less risk takers. So capitalism, all these animal spirits will evaporate gradually because these big corporations are not, these are private bureaucracies, and they are not so much interested in this bold risk-taking as capitalists are. But I wonder, the Chinese gradual transition to a socialist market economy is going the other way, right? We also have other countries which experimented with socialism, which never brought fruitful results in terms of economic organization. But I wonder if there is any difference of how countries transit from planned economy to the socialist economy with market elements, what China is doing. Related to this, I had a question about the China Development Bank. I think it has been largely praised for that entrepreneurial function in terms of providing credit, supporting mega projects, industries, both domestically and abroad. There have been a lot written on that. And I found very interesting how the reference you made, the connection to the great Chinese banks with the great German banks. And I kept thinking that when we look historically at how German banks evolved and how they brought a bunch of engineers and chemists in order to understand those industrial conglomerates, the industrialists. It was because they were trying to understand those private animal spirits, and they were trying to learn. And that's why they hired all these, engineers and also developed risk assessment methods and techniques in order to understand how the industrial sector evolves, so they could price the risk, so they can assess the technologies and so forth, so they can make these investment decisions. But I wonder, does it make any difference when we talk about the Chinese banks, which are indeed doing a great job in crediting, extending credit to priority sectors? They have, because recent studies demonstrate that they channel funds mostly to SOEs. And that's absolutely not to say that SOEs cannot be entrepreneurial. Of course, we know from a lot of studies that they can. So please don't treat my comment as, is I have any prejudices towards state-owned enterprises. But my question is more, do you think that there might be some differences that nowadays the great Chinese banks are learning from SOEs, while the German great banks were learning from those private large conglomerates, and whether there can be any difference there. And finally, I think I have a comment on central banks' dominance over credit provision, what Schumpeter is discussing. And in fact, I find it that it's not new. As early as 100 years before him, in 1820s, there were similar ideas expressed about the supremacy of central financial authority in organizing industry. And it was in France, and in fact, those ideas were taken aboard by the first, the history of finance treats this, the first industrial bankers in the 1850s, 60s. So I'm afraid that Schumpeter was actually not the first who said that.
You're referencing to Crédit Mobilier in France?
Yes.
Okay.
But even before that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Saint-Simonians and all that people. Yeah. And related to that, when we look at the developmental states or the post-World War development in East Asia particularly, what you find is that a lot of central banks were subordinated to the ministries of finance, in fact, and by obviously for a purpose, that the state, the government, would have a greater control over the central bank, who is closer to the market. And here we also have, this literature is quite slim, but there were in fact a lot of competition, sometimes rivalry between these two institutions. So even in that sense, it's peculiar why Schumpeter only talks about central banks. I think we also have, in the context of development as we see it, as we saw it, as we know it, the central bank is not the single institution that can do that. So I wonder if you find it relevant in the context of discussion of entrepreneurial state.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Olga. These were also brilliant remarks. So I think, Leonardo, you have the rest of the day to respond to all these issues.
Yeah, rest of the year. Until Christmas.
No, if you want to, you don't need also to address each of the points, but if you want to select a few, we are also getting a few questions from the audience. So I would say if you can take a first round of first answers, you don't need to get all of them. We will then open the floor also for some of the questions coming from the audience. And
Sure.
Just as a reminder to anyone who is in the audience who would like to join the panel, I see some question here, so we'll invite people who posted their Q&A to join the panel to raise specific question. Anyone else who want to do that, please raise your hand or book yourself in the Q&A session.
Okay, should I go?
Yes, please, Leonardo.
Okay, so yeah, you got me a lot of very good questions, and very good questions are those that you don't know very well how to answer. So I'm not sure that I'm gonna give you precise answers to your very sharp questions, but I'll try. Your first request, Antonio, was for me to tell something about Schumpeter's evolution. Well, I could stay the rest of the day doing this because this is a fascinating topic for me. And why is that? Because not only Schumpeter, but most original thinkers are quite, let's say, incoherent in their own evolutions because they dare to be. So in Schumpeter, you have a sort of a very strange, or I would say even quasi-schizophrenic tension in between evolution and equilibrium, because in the first edition, not the English translation of 34, but the first in German, there was, as you know, there was a 7th chapter that he cut. And in that 7th chapter, which was a large one, he explicitly states that, well, evolution and equilibrium sort of cancel themselves. Either you are into one or you are into the other. And if you look at Marx was the same. He has one foot in equilibrium and the other foot in the destruction and evolution and the destruction of capitalism. You look at Keynes. Keynes, you have expectations, you have a long-term and the state of confidence and an open-ended sort of path of economic fluctuations, but you also have the marginal efficiency of Keynes micro.
Marshall as well, no?
It's completely neoclassical. So I would even, let's say, propose that at some point we do seriously discuss this sort of divide in between, in theory, you have two avenues, equilibrium and evolution. If you are in one, you cannot be in the other. They cancel themselves. But this is a theoretical statement and hypothesis. Most of the big guys in the history of economic theory were in both. They almost didn't recognize that there was a fatal contradiction in that. And we can observe that. Minsky is the same. Minsky, they tend to evolve towards more, when they get like more seasoned, older, more experienced, etc., they tend to evolve more towards sort of the evolution thing and try to put sort of the equilibrium aside. But as Keynes said, it's very difficult to get rid of old ideas, and they themselves are proof of that. So Schumpeter, like in the 7th chapter, in the chapter about the creative destruction, he says it completely and out loud. Look, this creative destruction world, that is what capitalism is and where we exist, has absolutely nothing and cannot relate to equilibrium in any way. He says that. After that, he goes back to equilibrium. In his final book, History of Economic Analysis, he still like toys with the idea. And he's, I think till the end, he looked up to both Marx and Voraz. So it's schizophrenic, but it's not Schumpeter alone. Almost everybody, almost every big thinker has this. So I urge us, some of us, to really discuss this. Can equilibrium and evolution really coexist? My answer is no, they can't. So we have to opt. Either we go with the evolution, if you are interested in transformation, structural change, what are the determinants, what are the mechanisms, what are the outcomes, or we are interested in the lack of change, which is equilibrium. If you are interested in the lack of change, then we go to equilibrium. If you think that this is the relevant thing about capitalism, okay, be happy. If you think otherwise, well, you go evolution. You can't do both. And multiple equilibria doesn't solve anything because nobody knows what that is. The models don't tell you anything in terms of once you're out of equilibrium, you don't know how to get back. Either you start in equilibrium and stay there, or if you go out of equilibrium, you simply don't go back. And this is like starts with Arrow and Han and the big guys, and still you have that. So it's a shame for economics that it didn't figure this out yet. So that's one thing. You also said, mentioned this, some experiments in China. Well, I would say so many. The special economic zones, they're always experimenting. In that sense, I have a comment here. Mariana and Reiner published a paper, I don't think, not long ago, in terms of it's a very insightful paper, saying, okay, a good thing to, an important thing to do would be to try to merge the literature on Weberian bureaucracies and the dynamic capabilities approach in terms of like the Penrose and Thies and others, because we need to get the dynamic capabilities into the Weberian bureaucracies, which obviously I completely agree in terms of like a theoretical construction. I think this is a very promising and needed agenda. But empirically speaking, the developmental state already did that and does that. What you have there and what you have in China and Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Singapore, you have Weberian bureaucrats behaving in a Schumpeterian way. They're always changing. They're always experimenting with science policy, with technology, with the way they relate with private corporations, private domestic corporations, private foreign corporations. They're experimenting all the time. And what the good thing is that they tend to be pragmatic. What works goes. What doesn't work, especially the Chinese, what doesn't work, they don't pursue. So they start in one province, they start in one place, and if it works there, they move on and they disseminate. If it doesn't, they just cut it and they move on. This, I think, is a very good set of examples, or it opens up for this idea of experimentation as a way of, but under the direction of a sort of, it's not anarchy. It's something that it has method in the madness. There's a lot of method in the madness. So it's a sort of a coordinated and calculated madness. And this, I think, works. And the way, I think the last thing you said is...
Leonardo, just for the sake of time, just to give the chance also to the people from the audience to join, because we have another 20 minutes.
Okay, so okay, let me
accelerate a bit, because
see
otherwise...
what I have to say quickly in terms of Olga's also very smart and sharp comments. The first thing, Minsky, that's a very good one. Minsky, when I did that thing with Jan, and it's sort of a provocation, not a provocation, I think it's true. The Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, especially if they are not big corporations, if they are small corporations, they begin as quasi-Ponzis. And in that sense, you're saying, Olga, that, well, maybe a casino is needed. I would say, maybe not. What is needed is stable funding behind those quasi-Ponzis, so they don't stay Ponzis and very good ideas and very good projects don't die. But you have to have not like the sort of venture capital that in the US is provided mostly by the US state, not Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, Mariana showed that in the Entrepreneurial State. Linda Weiss showed that as well in her book, America Inc. Fred Block showed that in his collection of essays. So this is well documented. Silicon Valley jumps in afterwards. And so in that sense, this kind of entrepreneurial state which has finance on its hands is very useful. And let's remember, the Japanese banks, they were quasi-development banks until when? Until the Plaza Accord in '85. That's where everything started to derail in a way for Japan because it got financialized. And that was the problem. And then the bubble burst in '89, '90, and then you had a completely different sort of financial system. Korean banks, they started out as public banks, general part nationalized, all the thing. Taiwan banks, public. So public banking systems. And Korea started got a big flirt, almost married financialization, but kind of backed off. And now they are trying to reconstruct the developmental state. Taiwan never did it. Taiwan still maintained. Germany is a very interesting case because the German banks, the 4Ds, they were quasi-development banks as well, for all the reasons that you laid out. Well, now Deutsche Bank is a shame, right? Deutsche Bank is a disaster. But the whole German banking system consists also of several local banks, and those are development banks as well. And those are very important because they fund what? The small business, which are very much high-tech and very competitive in Germany. So Germany has also a very peculiar financial system that I don't think is well studied, especially for those who preach about the superiority of the big banks, the financialized big banks. And that gets me. I don't want to get in much detail here, but I think the big divide is something called financialization, which means the change in financial regulation. And I don't like the concept, it's not a concept, the word deregulation. This doesn't exist. It's never deregulation, it's always re-regulation. Deregulation is anarchy. You can do whatever you want. No, re-regulation is that, well, now private banks can do much more of what they want to do. You can leverage 30-to-1 instead of 7-to-1 or 10-to-1. Or you can do off-balance sheet operations. You can do offshore. You can do whatever. It's a new set of regulations. So again, Polanyi is right. It's the state that is always behind those sort of transformations in terms of the institutional framework, institutional environment as well, and the policy packages. So is the neoliberal state one that doesn't regulate? Of course not. It regulates like crazy, but it regulates for what? Expanding the room of maneuver for private corporations. So that's a completely different take in terms of, let the market do its job. No, the market never does its jobs very well. And for that, Minsky is really good because he tells us, well, capitalism is essentially a financial system in which markets tend to self-instabilize, not self-regulate. And that's brilliant because this is exactly what that is. And that's why banks should be, and the financial system as a whole should be very, very robustly regulated, which they are in China. And China is the big exception. Who is doing this sort of global infrastructure program? Who is financing for development in a global scale? China. Who else? Some states in Asia, and not many more. So again, they resisted financialization. They negotiated their way into the WTO and into sort of, they are now the biggest, the biggest banking system in the world, and they are opening up their financial system. But again and again, in a coordinated and controlled way. You should check, if you didn't yet, a piece by Ray Dalio. You know Ray Dalio, one of the founding partners of Bridgewater, one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. On the Financial Times this weekend, he was just saying, look, China is the big success right now in finance. And not only because it's, well, let's remember, it's the only country that's going to grow in the world this year. The only one. The others are all going down. And what Dali is saying is that, okay, and China is now going up and up and up in my portfolio because I know I can make money there. Why? Because they have all the enterprises and all the conditions in terms of growth. So he was not talking about I can arbitrage and I can leverage up there and I can do bets and do casino capitalism there. He was saying, there is the place where growth is. There is the place where technology is going like, is speeding up like crazy. So I'm going there. I think you should pay attention to that. That's a very interesting statement for a guy like Ray Dalio.
Renato, if I may, because we really are running out of time.
Okay, sure.
Shall I try to involve also some people from the audience? There are five questions.
Sorry that I went too long.
No, it's all very interesting. It's just I would like to bring in more people as possible. And one of the questions came from Milford Bateman. Milford, would you like to raise your question? Let's try to keep questions and answers briefly, and I'm sure people will have the chance to follow up. And I'll also promote other people to the panel who have already raised questions. Milford, you can start. I don't know what happened to Milford at the moment. You should be able to. Lucas, would you like to start instead? Because Milford seems to have some issues.
Oh yeah, sure. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's so interesting to see this evolution in Schumpeter's thought. And I never read business cycles, and so it's so good to have all of these quotations together in one place. I'm interested in the definition of socialism that Schumpeter gave. You advertised that Schumpeter has a different thinking there. He's different from the mainstream that treats socialism as public ownership of means of production. But then the definition that you gave looked pretty mainstream after all. So it had two elements. One was public ownership of means of production. And the second bit was that economic affairs are public affairs. Now my question is, how does that does it fit with your reading of Schumpeterian socialism as a way of the entrepreneurial state? Because it looks like the entrepreneurial state is something different than just public ownership of means of production. So my question is, shouldn't Schumpeter have provided a different definition of socialism?
Excellent, Lucas. Again, Charles, you raised a couple of questions. I think you have time for just one. So would you like to join?
Hi, yeah, sorry. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I'm sorry I had to pop out for a meeting and then come back, so I don't have the questions written down in front of me. But I think that one thing that I was very interested about was how this idea of kind of like this state organized creative destruction would work in practice. I think that although it's a lot easier to talk about these sorts of things in China, where maybe it's a little less democratic, it might be easier to kind of say, oh yeah, we're not going to do this anymore, or we're going to do that now. But in smaller countries and in countries where, I think the political decisions have a lot more real effects on kind of like voter preference, and I think it's not just about facts, but also about the politics of these decisions. I'm curious about how the creative destruction would work in centrally planned creative destruction would work in like a more democratic state.
Thanks, Charles. Giovanni, would you like to raise the last question? Unfortunately, Milford doesn't seem to be able to join us, but please, let's try to be brief so Leonardo has a few minutes to address the questions.
Good evening, everyone, or good morning. So my question was, you talked about basically selective credit from as a policy from the central bank in order to direct credit towards innovation and basically the new sectors or new innovations instead of the old. And my question is first whether the window guidance policy of the Japanese central bank from the 50s to the 80s is an example of it. And second, which is linked to that, basically then this policy ended, and it ended, as you said, with the Plaza Accord. But those accords were because basically it was the birth of the neoliberal world system. So with the free international capital flows. So then is this type of policy possible now, since this is still the kind of system that we have? Thank you.
Thanks, Giovanni. I think, Leonardo, you have another 4 good questions for the last 7-8 minutes.
Okay, let me go quick. Try to go quick. Lucas, okay. Well, I like Schumpeter's definition because it's basically, at least the way I take it, the more interesting way that I take it is that basically socialism means redesigning the frontiers in between the public and the private sphere, in the sense that the public sphere, the economic activities and the economic concerns become public concerns. And that opens up the space for a big role for state action. So, and then what he does condemn, or he excludes from the definition, is precisely, there is nothing to do with seizuring private property, expropriation of capitalists, nothing with that. And when you look at China, it's precisely that. All the private corporations, Chinese and every other corporations, are there and prospering, and they are incentivizing that. So the state and the companies, they work together, but it's a different design in terms of, institutionally speaking, it's a different design in terms of the frontiers. And who is the entrepreneur in chief? Answer, the Chinese state. But that doesn't steal power from the enterprise. It coordinates them. And as we see, as a matter of empirical reality, it works. And it's working better than almost other countries, right? So that's what I like about that. Charles, creative destruction there. I would say, what the hell is